All right, so let's get right into it. We're going to be talking about a guy named John Boyd. Now, this is a man who completely changed modern warfare. And he didn't do it with a bunch of stars on his shoulder or some high-ranking position. No, he did it with pure brain power. But to really get who he was, we've got to go way back, long before he ever saw the inside of a cockpit, because that's what made him the absolute renegade he was.
You know, this quote here, which was actually from his eulogy, pretty much says it all. It nails who this guy was. Think about it. Most people are defined by their promotions, their medals. Boyd? He was defined by the fights he picked. His whole life was a battle. And you know what? A lot of the time, it was against his own side. It just perfectly captures this brilliant outsider who was always at war with the system. So, to understand the warrior, you first have to understand the kid from Erie, Pennsylvania. And listen, this is not one of those golden boy origin stories. Not at all. Boyd was forged in some serious hardship, and that created a mindset that would define everything he did later on. I mean, just take a look at this. It's just one thing after another, relentlessly. His dad dies when he's only 3 years old. Boom, the family's thrown into poverty. Then his little sister Anne gets polio, and you gotta remember, back then they'd put a big quarantine sign on your house. So suddenly, they're not just a family dealing with sickness, they're outcasts. And if that wasn't enough, his older brother Bill, who struggled with schizophrenia, passes away in an institution. You see how all this just hammers home this idea? It forges him into this permanent underdog, always on the outside, always looking in. Now this right here, this was the gospel that his mother, Elsie, preached to him, day in and day out. In a world where they really had nothing, she taught him that their integrity was everything. And here's the key part. She didn't just tell him to have principles. She told him, people are gonna attack you for those principles, and you have to be ready to fight for them. And man, that became his prime directive for life. So in the middle of all this tragedy at home, Boyd found his way out. He found a purpose. And it wasn't on the ground in Erie, Pennsylvania. No, it was up in the huge, wide-open sky. But getting there was not going to be easy. And this is just perfect. It's so ironic. And it's a theme that follows him his whole life. He applies to be an aviation cadet during World War II and gets flat out rejected. The reason? Low aptitude. Let that sink in. The man who would go on to become maybe the greatest aerial tactician in history was told right at the start that he just didn't have the right stuff. Unbelievable. So he doesn't give up. He enlists in the Army Air Corps and gets shipped off to Japan right after the war. And there, as a private, he sees the enlisted guys freezing in tents while the officers are all warm and cozy in their quarters. And right next to them are these big, empty wooden hangars. So what does Boyd do? Well, the story goes he gets a group of guys together, and they just tear down 2 of the hangars for firewood. Of course, he gets threatened with a court-martial. But he just flips the whole thing on its head. He basically argues that the officers were the ones in the wrong for failing to take care of their men. And you know what? The charges disappeared. That is pure John Boyd. A direct, principled attack on a system that just doesn't make sense. So after Japan, Boyd hits the books. He uses the GI Bill to get through college, finally gets his commission, and then his wings. And where do they send him? Right into the Korean War. And that conflict would light the fuse for the intellectual explosion that became the rest of his life's work. His journey to combat was just fast and furious. He didn't just learn how to fly an airplane, he attacked it. To him, the training rulebook was, more of a suggestion. He was secretly going up and dogfighting his own instructors, pushing every plane he flew to its absolute breaking point. Not because he was reckless, but because he knew deep down that a fighter plane is a weapon, and you have to know its true limits if you want to win. Okay, so in Korea, the American F-86 Sabre jet was just wiping the floor with the enemy. American pilots were racking up this incredible 10-to-1 kill ratio against the Soviet-made MiG-15. That means for every 1 Sabre shot down, we were taking out 10 MiGs. It was a staggering number, and you can bet the generals back home were very, very happy about it. But for Boyd, this number wasn't a cause for celebration. It was a riddle. Because he knew something that most people either didn't know or didn't want to admit. On paper, the MiG-15 was actually the better jet. It could outclimb and outturn the Sabre. So the easy answer, oh, our pilots were just better, that just wasn't good enough for Boyd. It was lazy. And this one question, why did we win? It became an obsession. It was the question that would lead to his first huge intellectual breakthrough. Boyd comes home from Korea. He's not an ace, he doesn't have a bunch of kills, but he's got this burning question in his mind. He lands in an Air Force that's totally run by bomber generals, guys who thought fighter pilots were just hot-headed throwbacks. But out at Nellis Air Force Base, this forgotten patch of desert in Nevada, Boyd was about to become the spiritual leader, the high priest of the fighter pilot tribe. This slide just lays out the culture war perfectly. You had the Strategic Air Command, SAC, running the show. Their motto was literally, "Peace is our profession." They were the anointed ones, the serious, methodical guys flying their big B-52 buses. And then you had the fighter pilots. They were the exiles, the gunslingers sent out to what they called their Valhalla in the desert. And they weren't team players, oh no. In their own words, they were backstabbing assassins who lived for the thrill of the fight. And out there at this gladiator school in the desert, the highest honor you could get wasn't a medal. It was a title, Tiger. A tiger was a pure warrior, a pilot with that unteachable spirit of attack. Boyd didn't just earn that title, he became the living definition of it. So of course, he becomes this absolute legend. They start calling him 42nd Boyd. Why? Because he had this standing bet. He'd tell any pilot, and I mean any pilot, Air Force, Navy, Marines, you name it. He'd say, "All right, you start on my tail, you get the advantage." And he guaranteed he could turn the tables and be on their tail ready for the kill shot in less than 40 seconds. And get this, nobody ever beat him, not once. That's how good he was. 42nd Boyd.
So here's the really important thing to understand. This time at Nellis, it was about more than just being an amazing stick and rudder guy. It was the moment these two sides of Boyd fused together, the raw animal instinct of the warrior and the cold analytical mind of the scholar. And that combination, well, it was about to change the world.
You see, Boyd's time as the undisputed king of the sky, that was just the warm-up act. He had mastered the art of air combat. Now, he was about to master the science of it. And that leads us to the real question, right? What happens when a warrior scholar like this, a guy who is afraid of absolutely nothing and no one, turns his focus away from enemy MiGs and aims it squarely at the very institution he serves, the Pentagon itself? Well, that's where the real fight begins.